The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing, and I know we will be joined both by witnesses and members online today. And as with in-person hearing, members and witnesses are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Those joining remotely should keep themselves muted unless recognized by the chair and should expeditiously unmute themselves when recognized. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Good morning to everybody, and thank you all for joining this hybrid hearing. This hearing is entitled Promoting Economic Prosperity and Fair Growth Through Access to Affordable and Stable Housing. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. And again, thank you to our witnesses for being here. I'm excited about today's conversation because it may be one of the most important things this select committee takes up in terms of how we could create a better platform, a better foundation for people who are not at one end of the spectrum of disparity to actually get the mobility, the prosperity that allows them to become so over time. We will examine the critical role that stable and affordable housing plays in creating paths to economic prosperity and giving every American the opportunity to achieve the American dream. I'm looking forward to a productive discussion on how to access safe and stable housing, which, as I think we all know, is essential to living a healthy life, maintaining consistent employment, and engaging productively in society and the economy. We'll hear from our expert witnesses, who I'm delighted to see today, many old friends. I'm sorry not everybody can be here in person, but we'll hear from those witnesses about practical policies that Congress and others at the state and municipal level can adopt to help economically vulnerable Americans secure safe housing and make our nation's housing market more accessible. But putting forth equitable housing solutions today requires us to better understand past policies and how some have made a prosperous future possible and impossible for those in underserved and marginalized communities. We'll look back at some successes, the programs and agencies of the 1930s that led to the creation of the Housing and Urban Development Department, the establishment of the Fair Housing Administration, which made homeownership affordable to more Americans through mortgage insurance programs, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Community Reinvestment Act, and efforts of Congress in the 1950s and 1960s to leverage private investment to create a new affordable rental housing. We'll also assess some of our shortcomings. The institutional and economic forces that turned away Black and Latino Americans and limited their participation in civic and community life, redlining practices that all too often denied people of color and sought to maintain racially white neighborhoods, and missed opportunities to increase economic prosperity by reducing rent burdens for low-income residents. I'm particularly interested in inclusionary zoning. Though we at the federal level are perhaps not best positioned to examine and address this issue, this policy, which was first developed in the 1970s, that is to say inclusionary zoning, was a response to traditionally exclusionary zoning and often racially segregated ideas. Inclusionary zoning has the ability to leverage private investment to subsidize affordable housing. I'll note that I worked with Mr. Donovan on some of the successes in New York City associated with inclusionary zoning and a mayor's commitment to creating affordable housing in that city. Like most policies, inclusionary zoning isn't perfect, nor is it a silver bullet to our country's housing crisis. But it does underscore the success we can achieve for economically vulnerable Americans when the private and public sectors work together to expand housing opportunities for those most in need. And I really think that that's key. Most of us who've spent any time at all looking at the housing market know that there is a huge role for private developers and the functioning of a free market. But free market outcomes, absolute and unconditional free market outcomes, will not address the nation's affordable housing problem. So the question is, what is the right blend there? As we begin this hearing, promoting economic prosperity and fair growth through access to affordable and stable housing, let's remember that housing isn't just about ensuring a roof over one's head. It's the vital link between one's dignity and one's ability to participate and prosper in our society. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't agree more about the importance of today's hearing. Today, homeownership is becoming an impossible goal for too many Americans. Housing prices rose almost 20% last year, and rent followed at a rate increase close to 14%. With this increasing cost, many Americans are now priced out of the buying range for real estate, and as rents soar, people can't even save as much. Not only that, rising prices are forcing Americans to spend more and save less. This is keeping more Americans from buying their own homes. Let's take a look at what this means in real terms. If last year a couple wanted to buy a house was valued at $250,000, they'd begin trying to get maybe a 20% traditional mortgage, they need to save $50,000. And over the course of the last year, as the home prices spiked 20%, the $250,000 home is now $300,000, and the amount that they needed to save for a down payment increased by $10,000 from $50,000 to $60,000. Try pairing that $10,000 that are needed more with a 7.5% inflation rate that's been eating away at their income every year. How are Americans supposed to save extra for higher housing prices when their earnings are being eaten away by inflation? Instead of putting more money away to save for their down payment, Americans are dipping into their savings to cover costs instead of saving for tomorrow. This impossible situation has created a growing gap that prevents people from investing in a home. And the lack of supply of new homes is also driving up price. And we're seeing this in communities all over the country. We've seen a number of instances where the government has imposed unnecessary burdens on developers. This further reduces supply of housing and drives up prices. This is true both in the home ownership as well as the rental market. Let's take a case study. St. Paul, Minneapolis just instituted a citywide 3% rent control limit. When inflation hits 7.5% and costs are soaring, that creates a gap of over 4%. What incentive would anyone have to invest where they know they'd fail? When investors leave the market, it lowers supply. And when supply shrinks, prices rise. Some on the other side may attribute this increase in housing prices to greed or malice, but the truth is it's a simple economic formula. When costs exceed revenue, no one invests. When no one invests, supply shrinks. Limited supply, increased costs. It's a vicious cycle hurting Americans. It's time to get the economy back on track and identify ways to encourage home ownership. The first step we can take is reducing the regulatory burden on builders and investors. This will lower costs for renters and buildings while making the market more competitive. This can drive down prices and allow more money to flow into savings accounts. While reducing red tape is important, we also need to find ways to lower the input costs. Almost every input to put up a house or an apartment complex costs more today than it did a year ago. Specialized steel products, nails, PVC pipe. Let's look at PVC pipe. 10 feet of PVC pipe was $12.50 a year ago. Now it's approaching $50. And that's not even considering the cost of shipping and freight that comes into the factor when building a home, often increasing in some situations by 400%. And all of these are products that are actually needed to build a home. Everything from lumber in the frame of the house to the nail that holds it together is essential to every project. We need to get our lives back to normal so that families can save for their first homes in particular. We cannot allow inflation to drive the middle class away from building wealth. Mr. Chairman, I think we can agree that we need to find ways to make the housing market and housing in particular more affordable. It means bringing down costs. It means getting inflation under control to allow individuals to increase savings and to prevent those savings from being eaten away. And it means increasing supply across the board to bring down prices. I look forward to today's conversation. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Before we get to our witnesses, this committee has always tried to get out of Washington to raise up the voices of people who don't live inside the Beltway. That's why we went to Lorain, Ohio, and recently came back from Northern California, and we'll be shortly in Wisconsin to visit Ms. Moore's and Mr. Stiles' districts to hear from people. But we also start every hearing with just a 4-minute video of people who are living the life that we're here to talk about. So with unanimous consent, we will play a video of a number of Americans sharing their experience as part of the committee's mission to highlight these individuals.
we see a very intricate connection between affordable, safe, decent housing and economic prosperity. Some of the key barriers that we see for folks being able to both secure and maintain affordable housing is really the lack of it. A lot of Main Street workers and folks that are working at gas stations and other service industries simply don't make the living wage needed to live in market rate housing. Housing developers like Three Rivers that want to create affordable housing face significant challenges securing funds in order to do that. I'd like to tell you a little story about one of our tenants. Jeff moved into one of our townhomes, and because of the chaos of living unstably housed, he was unemployed. He was connected to the community resources he needed. He secured full-time employment that provided him enough income to take care of himself as well as his son without needing subsidized or rent-controlled housing. One of the best parts about my job really is being able to talk with folks who have been housed with us or been rehoused with some of our resources. And they come back to us and they say, you know what, because of this hand up, because of this opportunity you provided me, I was able to succeed in ways that I never thought were possible.
The cost of housing, I think the main reason we're talking today is what's going on with the cost of housing. And believe it or not, the embedded cost of fees, taxes, and other regulation, studies have shown that for the cost of housing, that embedded cost is somewhere between 25 and 32% of the final sales price or the final rent price. And that's a pretty large amount of what the end user is actually paying is based in that embedded cost. The biggest three impacts that we have on business today are the embedded cost of regulation inside of what we do, the rapid and out of control material price escalation that we're just falling victim to right now, and then the available of trained, skilled labor in our industry. And that's what we need help with today. And if today's meeting is about anything, please make it about those three things. That will help with the housing affordability crisis that we have in this country.
I'm a single mom with 4 kids. It is very hard to find housing when you are a single mom. I found a home. Even though the home was a little bit small, I didn't care. It was a roof over me and my kids' heads. They had me do everything that I was supposed to do. I had filled out the application, did the deposit. I didn't get the home because I guess I had too many kids. They told me I had a discrimination case. We won our case, and here we are now. I say to Congress, we need more support and help when it comes down to single parents that's doing everything for their children when it comes down to housing. At least lower the prices down of the housing, because a lot of us cannot afford that. I know I can't. I may work every day. I may have other stuff going on, but I take at least a day out of the week and make that for my kids. We play Uno. I teach them how to cook. We get in the kitchen. We bake cookies. We do everything, and we don't never miss a day. We moms, we are superheroes. We have to be strong for our kids. We have to show our kids. We have to teach them this is life and be prepared. But we get through this.
Okay, thank you again. Now we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have the Honorable Sean Donovan, former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and former Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Next, we will hear from Ms. Nikitra Bailey, Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the National Fair Housing Alliance. Next, we have Ms. Jacqueline Wagner, President of Solutions Division at Enterprise Community Partners, one of my former employers. Next, we have Mr. Kevin Nowak, Executive Director at CHN Housing Partners. And lastly, we'll hear from Dr. Salim Firth, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer directly in front of you or in a window on your Zoom screen, and that will indicate how much time you have left. For those joining remotely, the timer will appear again as a participant on your screen. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up your testimony so we can respect the time of the other witnesses and the committee members. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Secretary Donovan, welcome. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. I think you're on mute, Mr. Donovan. We'll back up the clock.
I just noticed that. Thank you. Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify before you to discuss the critical role affordable and stable housing plays in promoting prosperity, reducing economic disparity, and ensuring fairness and growth. But first, I want to recognize the suffering of the people of Ukraine and add my voice to the worldwide outrage over Russia's unprovoked invasion. Every person deserves a place they can call home, whether here in the United States or across the globe. But decent, affordable, stable housing also plays a central role in our country's shared economic success. If our children can't grow up in homes that allow them to reach their full potential as our future workforce, we will never build an economy that provides the prosperity and fair growth our nation deserves. This hearing comes at a unique moment as the COVID pandemic has demonstrated in the starkest terms the importance of home to our health and prosperity. But this acute crisis only compounds a chronic crisis of unaffordable and unstable housing that's been growing for decades. Increasing economic inequality has contributed to this growing crisis, but housing is also a key driver of slower growth and rising inequality in three primary ways. First, housing has become increasingly unaffordable across the country, squeezing out spending that is critical to families' health and economic mobility, while leading to poor housing conditions and instability that further disrupt their chances of success. Second, homeownership remains the primary wealth building tool in our country. Staggering and growing disparities in homeownership rates along racial and economic lines have deepened inequality and cut off pathways to prosperity. Third, housing is unique in its link to neighborhoods. Persistent racial and economic segregation has been exacerbated by rising rents and home prices, cutting off access to neighborhoods that offer more opportunity to families. Our government has a historical responsibility to remedy these challenges because it helped to create them. Government-sponsored discrimination and segregation contributed to the wide disparities in housing quality, wealth creation, and neighborhood opportunity between Black and white households. However, recent decades have also seen new and innovative solutions emerge that should give us hope that Congress can promote prosperity and fair growth through more affordable and stable housing. During my career in public service, I've seen that we can make progress, and the remarkable work of my fellow witnesses today confirms that hope. Decent, affordable, stable housing is a basic necessity for building life of opportunity and success, yet it's increasingly out of reach for too many Americans. With housing the single largest expense in family budgets, this has increased hardship, diverting spending from food, health, and other critical items. It also leads to instability through evictions and even homelessness that disrupt jobs, schooling, and community networks. Fortunately, Congress has proven tools to provide decent, affordable, stable housing. Rental assistance programs directly attack the problem, helping families afford healthier, more stable housing and spend more on critical other items such as food and healthcare. Capital investments for construction and preservation of affordable housing are also critical because they ensure we build more affordable housing to counter the shrinking number of affordable homes across the nation. The benefits of these housing programs are particularly powerful for children, given the lifelong effects inflicted by overcrowding, poor nutrition, and environmental health, frequent moves between schools, and even homelessness in their formative years. Despite the clear success of these housing programs, they remain dramatically underfunded compared to the scale of the problem. To make progress on our country's housing affordability crisis, Congress should substantially increase investment in the critical programs we know work, as outlined in my written testimony. Homeownership also has a key role to play in promoting economic prosperity and fair growth as the most important wealth building tool for American families. It can decide whether a family starts a business, sends their children to college, or survives the economic shock of a sudden illness or other calamity. Yet it remains out of reach for far too many who are ready to buy a home. Here too, Congress can invest in proven solutions to make owning a home more affordable and close the racial and economic gaps in home ownership rates. These steps include investing in direct assistance and tax credits to bridge the most important barrier to home ownership, the down payment, as well as housing counseling. Reform the mortgage interest deduction as a credit to ensure families that don't itemize their deductions can still take advantage of this benefit. Invest in fair housing and fair lending programs, and modify lending criteria and pricing to ensure greater access for first-time home buyers. A third pathway for housing to promote economic prosperity and fair growth is through the unique connection it has to neighborhoods. When you choose a home, you choose so many other factors that contribute to prosperity and fair growth. Access to jobs, quality education, good healthcare, physical safety, and many others. Unfortunately, we have far too many low opportunity communities across our country, in no small part because our neighborhoods remain deeply segregated by race and income. We've also seen fewer families move in recent decades because of the rising cost of housing. This has threatened one of the traditional strengths of the American economy, the flexibility of our workforce to move where the jobs are, and reduced output by more than $1 trillion a year. To right this wrong, Congress should increase investment in housing vouchers that allow families to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, invest in place-based programs that are targeted at benefiting low opportunity neighborhoods, support inclusionary zoning and other efforts to reduce the barriers to building affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods, and strengthen fair housing efforts that reduce barriers for people of color and others to live where they choose. Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee, thank you again for the invitation to testify before you. I urge you to use this moment of crisis to invest in housing assistance and other tools that will remedy our nation's housing challenges. Together, we can build a fairer, more inclusive, and prosperous nation.
Thank you, Secretary Donovan. Ms. Bailey, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. I am Nikitra Bailey, Senior Vice President of Public Policy of the National Fair Housing Alliance, the country's only national nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to eliminating housing discrimination and ensuring equitable housing opportunities for all. I am here on behalf of more than 170 local fair housing organizations to make the case for a substantial investment in housing, such was passed in the House's version of President Biden's Build Back Better Act. My testimony shows federal laws and policies created residential segregation, the dual credit market, institutionalized redlining, and other structural barriers. Families that received opportunities through prior federal investments in housing are among America's most economically secure citizens. Those who did not continue to be excluded. Congress and President Biden can rectify inequities created by the federal government by investing in our nation's bedrock of opportunity, housing. We stand at a crossroad of several crises, a reckoning that demands an end to racial injustice, a pandemic with disparate impacts on communities of color, deepening racial and gender wealth gaps, and a housing affordability and homelessness crises, all of which threaten our future prosperity. Thousands of race-conscious housing, banking, and other policies established systems and structures that were highly inequitable and persist today. They created and perpetuated segregation and actually reshaped communities, setting up a built environment that connects place and opportunity in a manner that is highly correlated to race. Unfair laws also produced a separate and unequal financial system, rewarding white households while crippling and debilitating African American, Latino, AAPI, and Native households. They also generated restrictive zoning ordinances and policies that lock families of color in toxic spaces where land, air, and water are contaminated, making these families more susceptible to climate impacts. Unjust laws created the U.S. racial wealth, health, and homeownership gaps that recycle inequality. These systems and discriminatory policies also have produced trillions of pieces of data that have been used to develop technologies that then maintain disparities. Despite housing discrimination being unlawful for 102 years, Prior to the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, long-standing discriminatory policies produced segregated housing patterns. As a result, Black homeownership, the primary asset of Black families, is at levels similar to when discrimination was legal. We've yet to move the needle on the persistent 30 percentage point advantage that whites have over Blacks in homeownership rates. More recently, actions leading to the Great Recession and the response to it created a net drain on homeownership. Black and Latino families lost $1 trillion in wealth from being steered into dangerous, toxic, subprime loans, despite many qualifying for safer and more affordable credit. While we have passed civil rights statutes to stop discrimination, we have not designed laws to dismantle the systems of inequality that are still producing biased impacts. In this nation, where you live matters. Your zip code is your destiny. Race-conscious policies favoring whites created today's disparities, and only race-conscious remedies can fix them. Bold, innovative solutions like the Equal Credit Opportunities Act, special purpose credit programs are already law. Coupling special purpose credit programs with Chairwoman Waters' first-generation down payment assistance can begin to address existing racial homeownership and wealth gaps. America faced an affordable housing crisis long before COVID-19 struck us. There is no city where someone making the minimum wage can afford to live in a two-bedroom apartment. COVID-19 made it clear that housing is essential and fundamental. The Build Back Better Act can lead us forward with a substantial investment in housing. It makes clear that housing's rightful place is among the infrastructure investments central to a well-functioning society and economy. Americans across the political spectrum overwhelmingly believe that every child should have access to safe, decent, and affordable housing, and that zip codes should not determine success in life. Republicans and Democrats support increased funding for housing. We commend Speaker Pelosi, Chairwoman Waters, and other members in the House for passing the necessary housing provisions in the Build Back Better Act, including the single largest investment in fair housing enforcement. The Senate should follow suit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Ms. Wagner, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I truly believe that addressing these issues will lead to more prosperous and equitable future for all. I am president of the Solutions Division of Enterprise Community Partners. For 40 years, Enterprise has improved millions of lives across all 50 states through access to affordable housing. This work is deeply personal to me. My parents took part in the Great Migration, moving from rural East Texas to California in pursuit of the American dream, seeking higher paying jobs and greater economic opportunity for their children. Growing up, I was bused 45 minutes from our home in South Los Angeles to a predominantly white school in West Los Angeles for a better education. Every day, I was exposed to two communities divided by race, wealth, and opportunity, but also by housing quality, property values, and private investment. It is that firsthand experience coupled with my affordable housing expertise, which I base my testimony today. For far too long, Black and Indigenous people and people of color have been denied access to certain neighborhoods and housing through redlining, deed covenants, and racialized zoning. Even after the 1968 Fair Housing Act banned discrimination in housing, the legacies of the past continue to put these communities at disadvantage. Where a person lives has profound implications on education, health, lifetime earnings, and even life expectancy. There are also economic repercussions when people are forced to spend too much of their paychecks on housing or unable to grow wealth through homeownership. They have less to invest back into their communities. It is that understanding that improving access to safe, affordable housing also improves social outcomes for families and communities that drives much of what we do at Enterprise. We are leading a $3.5 billion investment and historically marginalized housing providers to build equity in neighborhoods. With this investment, we hope to dismantle the legacy of racism in housing. Racism that has long held back what types of homes get built, where they get built, and who builds them, all of which has led to the enormous wealth gap that we see today. Recently, Enterprise launched a $180 million initiative to accelerate revitalization and cross-sector collaborations in 9 key majority Black communities across 7 states that have experienced disinvestment. We've teamed up with local partners to drive the integration of racial equity impact assessments. Due to our efforts, we have a commitment from one of the nation's largest cities to promote racially equitable outcomes through the low-income housing tax credit. And we are building the capacity of housing practitioners to enhance homeownership in Native communities. It takes bold action to address the longstanding economic and racial and disparities and promote economic growth so that everyone and every community can thrive. I commend this committee for its bipartisan commitment to housing as a critical component of economic security and mobility. Clearly, systems change is needed. At Enterprise, we have 3 priorities. Number 1, federal tenant protections through policies like source of income protections. Number 2, appropriations and support for renters receiving federal housing subsidies, including the expanded use of earned income disregard and increasing funding for family self-sufficiency program. And third, supporting community ownership models. On behalf of Enterprise community partners, I'd like to offer my gratitude to Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stow, and members of the committee for your bipartisan leadership and recognition of the need for bold action to move our country forward in a more equitable, inclusive, and prosperous direction for all. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Mr. Nowak, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stiles, and distinguished members of the committee. Good morning. My name is Kevin Nowak, and I am Executive Director of CHN Housing Partners and CEO of our affiliated nonprofit mortgage company, CHN Housing Capital. It is a great honor to be here with you today and to share my perspective on the importance of affordable housing. I look forward to discussing ways that we can better support our families and communities by empowering our residents to achieve housing stability and the American dream of homeownership. CHN is a Cleveland, Ohio-based nonprofit with 40 years of experience as an affordable housing developer, housing stability service provider, and residential mortgage lender. Our organizing principle is the power of a permanent address, and we believe that stable, affordable housing changes lives and improves communities. Over the years, our organization has evolved significantly, and we have expanded our programs and services to meet the needs of our community. The need for housing stability services is great, and a combination of local, state, and federal, private and public interventions are necessary to address the needs of our community. No matter where a customer is when we first meet each other, CHN wants to meet our customers where they are and empower them to get to where they want to be. Our base level of programs are crisis intervention programs that respond to critical emergency needs like homelessness and eviction. CHN's response to these crisis needs include both 1, increasing and maintaining housing supply, and 2, delivering stability services. We administer utility bill pay assistance to help prevent shutoffs and disconnections. We administer emergency home repairs to replace furnaces that have gone out during the winter. We run eviction and foreclosure prevention programs, including what is one of the best performing emergency rental assistance programs in the country, having deployed over $53 million to 14,000 households during the pandemic. We are the lead developer of a decade-plus long effort of the Housing First initiative, which has developed 700 plus units of affordable housing through the low-income housing tax credit to reach a near functional zero for individuals with chronic homelessness in Cuyahoga County. This estimate is based on pre-pandemic numbers, and we are reevaluating the need at this point in time, especially in light of the pandemic. Beyond these crisis responses, we also provide a suite of stabilization services to meet community needs. In response to these needs, again, CHN provides both supply of affordable housing through real estate development and services such as household savings initiatives like weatherization and energy conservation programs. In real estate development, we provide housing for individuals, families, and seniors through the local housing tax credit, LIHTC, whether it be multifamily apartments, townhomes, or single-family homes, preservation, or new construction. We hope that this committee understands and recognizes the importance of LIHTC, the best investment tool we have available for affordable housing in this country. Finally, we recognize that the power of a permanent address extends far beyond crisis intervention or household stability. A safe, stable, affordable place to call home can have dramatic impacts on quality of life, generational wealth, and health and wellness. And at the centerpiece of this wealth building is homeownership. Having an increased net worth allows homeowners to leverage their investment for emergencies and long-term planning like college. Personally, I grew up in a blue-collar family in the city of Detroit. My dad was a police officer and my mom worked at a Catholic grade school. If it hadn't been for the equity in our home and my parents' willingness to leverage it to pay for my college education, I would not be here today. Unfortunately, this critical generational wealth building tool is out of reach for too many Americans, especially for low-income households and Black and brown households. CHN's enrichment programs address these long-term financial and homeownership gaps through counseling and education, creating supply through development, and filling gaps in the lending market. I want to especially highlight two of our most exciting homeownership programs. The first is our flagship lease purchase program, which utilizes live tech to develop a 15-year pathway to homeownership for families we serve. Over the history of our program, we have helped over 1,400 families become homeowners, and over 95% remain homeowners for 5 years after buying their home, showing that the program is producing sustainable homeownership. The second program, broadly speaking, is CHN Housing Capital, our certified community development financial institution. CHN Housing Capital provides access to lending products for those historically locked out of the market. Now we offer a full suite of services and products, including down payment assistance, home repair loans, and first mortgages. Our Believe mortgage product focuses on small dollar lending, filling a major gap in our community. In less than 1 year, our Believe mortgage product has received significant attention. We worked with over 70 borrowers in Cuyahoga County and originated 30 loans, reflecting a significant unmet need in our community. It's impossible to cover the need for housing services, the work that CHN does, in 5 minutes, but I hope this has been a helpful snapshot. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with this committee today, and please connect with us at CHN if you ever have questions or ideas to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nowak. Dr. Firth, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the Select Committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss housing affordability. My name is Salim Firth, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. The Mercatus Center uses market-oriented ideas grounded in academic research to address public policy problems at every level of government. The primary driver of high housing costs is strict local land use regulations, so most of my policy work takes place at the state and local levels. I've had the privilege of working alongside problem solvers in many of the districts represented in this committee, such as the city staff in Gainesville, Florida, Desegregate Connecticut, and Texans for Housing. One of the best things you can do is to encourage those in your districts who are working to protect property rights and fair housing, and to draw attention to the barriers they face. With the increase in rent and home prices that has occurred over the past 2 years, housing is less attainable than ever in many places. There are some powerful national trends that have led to the increase in housing prices, including low interest rates, increased demand for home office space, supply chain interruptions, and lumber tariffs. On the last point, the current administration has doubled down on the previous administration's mistake, increasing the tax on Canadian lumber from 9% to 18%. Supposedly, the Canadians are making lumber too cheap. That's probably false, but even if it were true, why would we not happily accept some housing subsidies from our neighbor and ally? The administration should cancel the tariffs and send a thank you card instead. But we also need to zoom into the local level. My colleague, Kevin Erdman, has argued that the crisis of 2007 was exacerbated by federal policymakers who treated housing as one big market. Nationally, housing starts were high. But at the same time, Americans were streaming out of metropolitan areas like Los Angeles and New York. This was not a housing glut, he argues, but an unaffordability exodus. A new research builds on Erdman's story. Rebecca Diamond and Enrico Moretti used detailed expenditure data to show that high wages do not translate into higher consumption at the city level. A typical household, headed by a high school degree holder, earns 18 grand more per year in San Diego than in Grand Rapids. But after taxes and adjusting for local prices, real consumption is 5 grand higher in Grand Rapids. How did we get into this situation? Well, part of it is regional differences in demand. But the bigger issue is differences in the way that housing supply responds to demand. When demand for housing in Grand Rapids rises, the market mostly responds with more houses. That's a flexible market. When demand for housing in San Diego rises, the market mostly responds with higher prices. That's a rigid market. And San Diego's current prices reflect decades of rising demand. Federal solutions that treat the housing market as an undifferentiated mass are likely to widen those disparities. Suppose we offer every home buyer 10 grand toward a down payment. That would increase housing demand the same nationwide. But in rigid markets like San Diego, the result would mostly be higher prices. Sellers of existing homes would pocket the extra 10 grand, and construction would barely change. But in flexible markets like Grand Rapids, the subsidy would mostly boost construction. In the end, a national subsidy would create even more regional inequality and result in even higher prices in the places at the center of the current crisis. It would also echo the run-up to the 2007 crash when national averages masked drastically different trends across regions. Instead, the solution to sky-high housing prices has to involve greater housing supply, specifically in markets where it is more constrained. New Rochelle, New York, showed one way to achieve this: increasing downtown height limits and eliminating several sources of uncertainty from its permitting process. The result is 7,000 new apartments, a revitalized downtown, and fiscal improvement for the city. Helena, Montana showed another way. Rather than fighting explosive growth in demand with stricter regulation, which would only raise prices, it repealed minimum lot sizes and loosened other standards. State action is also appropriate. For example, bipartisan legislation in California has required cities to allow accessory dwelling units, with tens of thousands being built or legalized in the past 4 years. These are small steps, but for the first time in decades, they're going in the right direction. I encourage you and other federal policymakers to look deeper, all the way down to city councils and neighborhood meetings, to understand the causes of and solutions to our national housing affordability crisis. Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you, Dr. Firth. I now recognize myself for questions. Secretary Donovan, let me start with you, but I'm going to invite other witnesses to chime in around this question if they have different views than you have. Secretary Donovan, we often hear that what we need is more government subsidy in the form of a different mortgage tax deduction, in the form of more LIHTC, in the form of more Section 8 vouchers. Here's a slightly harder question, and I start with you because you've had both the municipal and the federal perspective. If we someday live in an environment of constrained resources and we're really trying to identify what the marginal dollar of subsidy is that most effectively puts Americans into affordable housing, what are the one or two programs that in your experience are most effective in the use of that marginal dollar?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I would start by saying that when you look at the broad set of housing challenges that we've talked about today, there's no question that for the lowest income Americans, generally renters, that rental assistance and homelessness prevention programs are the single best use of a dollar to avert not just the most extreme housing problems, but the economic consequences, ruining childhoods, ruining the prospects of families that we see. So I would certainly focus on Section 8 vouchers, on homeless assistance programs as the single best use of that dollar. I would also say, though, agreeing with some of the testimony we've heard today, that there are many things we can do to lower costs and to make housing more affordable, particularly around land use and inclusionary zoning and other steps that we've heard about. And finally, I would just say that as a former budget director, we should be looking at dollars that aren't as well spent as they could be. And I think clearly the mortgage interest deduction could be reformed and better targeted to both create much more opportunity for first-time home buyers by making it a credit rather than a deduction, and at the same time to save substantial dollars that could be reinvested in more targeted housing solutions.
Secretary Donovan, I'm going to ask you just a 15-second response before I invite other witnesses to answer the same question. You and I actually worked with a number of homeless alleviation programs in New York City. Name a few that you think are particularly effective that the committee should talk to, understand, and hold up as good examples.
Well, let's be clear. So many people think about homelessness as an unsolvable problem. During the Obama administration, we made dramatic progress cutting veterans' homelessness in half through tools like VASH. And what we've seen in particular, especially for those who are what we call chronically homeless, who struggle with substance abuse or other challenges, mental health challenges, that supportive housing is a profound solution that not only dramatically reduces human suffering and can end homelessness, it also can pay for itself through the reductions in costs that we see in healthcare, in institutional facilities, prisons, emergency room spending. And so I would particularly point to efforts like in supportive housing, like VASH for veterans, that have been dramatically successful. And the ESG program at HUD is an especially important tool to do that.
Thank you. And let me just in 30 seconds or so see if other witnesses want to have a different, yes, ma'am.
I would just add that we need to enforce our nation's fair lending and fair housing laws. Discrimination is a drag on the economy. Over the last 20 years, research shows that we've seen our GDP suffer by $16 trillion. And it actually shows that if we address discrimination that's targeted at Black Americans alone, we would actually have an opportunity to grow our nation's economy by $1 trillion over the next 5 years every year.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Any other witnesses want to quickly chime in with thoughts there? Yes, sir, Mr. Nowak.
Yes, I would look at the low-income housing tax credit as a really viable solution. It provides that subsidy, but it also encourages public-private partnership and the investment in affordable housing by the private market. What we see in low-income housing tax credit is providing housing for people from the extremely low income through that 60% low income realm. It is the most important tool that we have in this country for both preserving and creating new supply.
Thank you, Mr. Nowak. I want to change gears here really quickly. We've identified and we're going to hear more about the cost of housing. And I suspect we're going to hear more. And we did hear about regulation. For the decade plus I've been here, I've been engaged in conversations about regulation, and they're often dumb conversations because one side would have you believe that we should just get rid of all of it. The other side sort of is not necessarily discriminating in how they think about it. So let's just, in the video that we saw, the gentleman from Florida said that based on surveys, this is not analytical work, but based on surveys of builders, roughly a quarter of the cost of a home is regulation related. It's not clear to me what that means or how analytically sound that number is, but let's just stipulate that that number is close to correct. Now, let's also stipulate that we don't want to use carcinogenic materials in our homes. We don't want asbestos in our homes. We don't want third floor balconies that don't have railings and toddlers are falling off of them. In my district, we don't want, which is subject to hurricanes, we don't want houses that blow over when there's a hurricane. So let me ask this question, Mr. Firth. Dr. Firth, I'm going to put you on the spot here since you're our minority witness here. Let's just have an estimate of that. If you agree with me that a lot of regulation is important to keeping Americans safe and healthy, roughly speaking, how much of that 23.8% that the home builders say is associated with regulation is just out and out wasteful, not about keeping Americans safe?
That's a great question. So my understanding is that those surveys are looking at changes in regulations since, say, the 1990s or something. So if you think of a 1990s house, it has all the regulations you just listed are all going to be in place. Maybe there's one or two carcinogenic substances we've discovered since then. So basically, they're looking at what's the change in regulation. I would say that's not my favorite way to approach the question, right? So in your district in southwestern Connecticut, regulation is a huge portion of the cost because regulation really affects the land. It can take a piece of land that would be worth, if you just sort of randomly took a place in America, might be worth $2,000 as agricultural or forestry land. And because of the scarcity of buildable residential land in specifically high demand areas, that could be worth $800,000 on its own, just the dirt.
But Dr. Firth, I'm out of time. What I'm really looking for here from any witness, and I'm out of time, so I'm gonna have to follow up, but I am all for doing away with regulations that are destructive, that serve no purpose. But every time I ask that question, I get either no examples of wasteful, duplicative, or destructive regulations, or I get something that's about keeping Americans from getting cancer or their homes blowing over in hurricanes. So I'm not going to let this bone go Because again, you'll find bipartisan support for the elimination of destructive regulations. But let's just remember that regulations is about keeping homes from blowing over in hurricanes and Americans from getting cancer. With that, I'm going to yield back my time and recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Firth, if I can, I think one of the things that really sticks out in your commentary, we often talk about the housing market as one cohesive United States of America housing market. It's obviously very different in different places. And so I dug in on kind of what was the median price in my hometown of Janesville, Wisconsin, what's the median price in San Diego, for sake of a high-cost region. The numbers I was pulling out was about $175,000 was roughly the median price in my hometown. That'd be roughly what the block was that I lived on a handful of years ago. The mortgage payment for that would be about $1,000. You look at what the median price is in San Diego, $875,000. Mortgage price then would come out somewhere in the neighborhood of $4,000 a year. And if you back into this and you say you got to have about 28% of your household income is going to go into housing, what would kind of be your income that you would need to be able to sustain this median price? In Janesville, it would be in the neighborhood of $19 an hour. In San Diego, you're almost approaching a $200,000 a year or $100 an hour, that type of range. It really strikes me that we're having a national discussion, but it's incredibly regional. And you touched on what some of the differences are in some of the zoning regulations. I think the chairman actually brings up some really good points, right? What can we do? But can you highlight some of the areas that you think we can look at, especially in this great disparity between different geographic regions and the price, and what we can be doing to drive that price down?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. So, and I touched on this in my statement, but this really interesting research coming out really showing just how far high salaries don't go in high wage areas. I think there's something that we've believed, perhaps wrongly, for a long time, which is that for most Americans, if they moved to a New York or a San Francisco, their wages would rise a bunch, and that would offset the cost of living. And the new research is showing that not so much. You know, at best, you're going to sort of like maintain parity and be able to maintain the lifestyle you're able to have in Janesville by moving to San Diego. But for most people, especially those who don't have advanced degrees, you'll actually experience a decline in your living standards by moving to a high wage city, which is really a pity because there's a lot of great things. There's a reason wages are high there. But yeah, to the regulation question and to the chairman's question, so here's a totally useless regulation. Some suburbs require brick cladding on houses because they believe that it drives up the prices and keeps the type of people who move to that suburb more affluent.
Mr. Only based on time, I think that's great. I'll look for you and all of our witnesses to dive into that, because I think that's spot on that we see some of these local zoning regulations that are actually there to drive costs up. I want to ask you a question, because we heard time and again a push towards subsidization. What's the impact of that? Does that increase total supply, or does the subsidization actually just drive up costs and in the long run make it less affordable? In the short term, gives you a bit of a sugar high, right? We want to keep people in their homes, not lost on me. What's the real medium and long-term implications of a subsidization approach?
Yeah, so in a place like Janesville, more subsidies probably means more construction. But in a place like San Diego or New York, more subsidies mostly means higher prices because it's a fixed supply of houses and you're putting more dollars in to chase those. It's really important to provide housing for those whose incomes do not get there. But when, as your example of San Diego shows, when you're essentially putting the middle class into the position that a minimum wage worker in every city would be in, then you've got a broken public policy. We should not be giving housing subsidies to people with middle class incomes.
I think that's an interesting point. In particular, as we subsidize higher cost housing, it can have a real impact in making housing more expensive. Ms. Bailey, you noted your support of Build Back Better. Do you support the provision for the SALT tax cuts, in particular to subsidize high cost housing for individuals in the Build Back Better plan?
So I just want to say,
just yes or no, do you support that provision?
1 out of 7 investors.
Yes or no, do you support the provision? I got you, got a lot of ideas.
Driving up the
do you
cost of
support that
housing.
provision?
1 out of 7 investors.
No,
all
do you
across
support,
the
yes,
nation
I'll take
are
that as a
driving up the cost
non-answer.
of housing.
Mr. Firth, do you support the provision of the SALT tax cuts that was passed in the Build Back Better plan by my Democratic colleagues?
No, although I would benefit enormously from it.
Say it again?
I mean, my income would go up as a Maryland homeowner, if that was
Sure,
discussed,
it
but
subsidizes-
as a public
subsidizes
policy
high
matter,
cost.
I'm not the person you should be subsidizing.
But regardless of the impact on you, it subsidizes high-cost housing, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Did it make housing more affordable, or did it actually just drive up the cost for other people?
No, drives up the costs.
Drives up the cost. So subsidization drives up the cost, makes it unaffordable, and in the Build Back Better plan, my Democratic colleagues did just that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Moore, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and all of my colleagues, and especially to the witnesses. This is a very important subject today, and all of you have really given some compelling testimony. I just want to start out with the fair housing, our fair housing witness, just to acknowledge that Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think was one of the very first cities to have a fair housing program. And we have endured over the decades various housing policies that really don't seem to change things very much. I was so embarrassed to have Matthew Desmond win some Pulitzer Prize about the evictions in Milwaukee and having my colleagues bully me until I read the book about evictions in Milwaukee. So bad that they have compared the crisis of evictions among Black women in Milwaukee to the highest incarceration rate in the country among Black men. One of the things that our ranking member talked about subsidization, and I know you didn't get a chance to really answer his question, but subsidy comes in more forms than just a mortgage interest deduction. It comes to low-income housing tax credits. It comes from Section 8 housing, and yet really creating that it's elusive to the average person. In Milwaukee, and Mr. Chairman, please indulge me, Milwaukee, the average rent plus utilities is like $865 a month. I once gave a speech in Oakland, California, and mentioned that number, and it was like they almost dragged me out of there somewhere to shoot me. Or where is this house for $865 a month? And so, how do I remember when we first had Section 8. Great incentive. Problem is that it just drove the rents up for poorer people. Low-income housing tax credits, I've used them as a professional. I think they're wonderful. There are not enough of them. How do you prevent gentrification through some of the programs? How do you prevent people ghettoizing neighborhoods by only putting the credits in certain neighborhoods? And how do you do something that is anti-socialist? I guess I really want to disaggregate this policy, acknowledge that there is a dearth of low-income housing. How do we do it with the existing programs change so that we are in fact subsidizing the poorest people and not the richest people? Just one last point before I turn it over to the witnesses to respond. The 67% of the housing stock in my community was built before 1960. Matter of fact, I live in a house that was built in 1920. Beautiful German-built house, oak, wood, but of course, all the other problems that come with a house built in 1920. What products are there for those properties, but for the constant solicitations we get from unknown people, corporations who want to buy that property up and force you out? You don't have any money to fix it up. You can't get the underwriting. Oops, is that a gavel? Okay. And so I really am enthusiastic to hear, and I guess I want to hear from you first.
Yes, 1 out of 7 homes actually has been purchased by investors, driving up the cost of housing. So I agree, we have a national market that has regional implications, but investors in California and New York are buying homes in Wisconsin and in places like Durham, North Carolina, driving up the cost of housing for ordinary working Americans. So we also have to talk about the reality that our federal government has subsidized development of housing since we created the Fair Housing Administration. Private developers have been subsidized, and they have contributed to today's wealth inequalities. So when we're talking about subsidies, we have to think about them broadly and inclusively, and think about how we can make sure we are utilizing our nation's fair lending laws to have inclusive subsidies, subsidies that bring us all in. We know that housing accounts for 20% of our overall economy. If we don't have a successful housing market, we won't have a successful economy. Families of color are the homeowners and the renters of today. We have to do everything that we can to bring them in.
Yes, sir. Mr. Nowak? You had a lot to say about the subsidies. What are the most valuable subsidies in order to decrease these disparities?
Sure, Congresswoman, thank you.
Do I not?
So-
I don't know the names. That's the problem. Go on.
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. So I'll break this down in a couple of different pieces based upon your comments. When we look at the low-income housing tax credit and we look at affordable housing in Cleveland, we're based in Cleveland, Ohio. We also do work in Detroit. There's comparable data in Detroit. To construct or preserve affordable housing for people who are low to moderate income, the rents, as we restrict them at 60% of area median income or less, do not pencil out to allow for that development without the subsidy of the low-income housing tax credit.
Right.
So I think that's one step. The second step in regards to where we place the properties really focuses on the qualified allocation plan. So through the low-income housing tax credit program, each state is required to come up with a set of criteria for how to be awarded tax credits. Within that program, and Ohio is a good example, states can incentivize the development of affordable housing throughout all neighborhoods, not just in one. And in fact, Ohio specifically incentivizes the development of affordable housing, preservation of that, to create mixed income neighborhoods.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I haven't figured out how to do this in 5 minutes. So such important subject, but
I thank the gentlelady. Depending on member attendance, we may have an opportunity for second round, but I want to set aside that decision until we see who's online and who shows up. With that, Mr. Davidson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks to
the gentleman yell. You know what I'm going to do.
briefly.
Happy birthday, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Thank you. And happy birthday to the state of Ohio. So, look, I appreciate our witnesses calling attention to this because it's incredibly important for everyone I know. If for the handful of people that housing isn't the biggest expense, healthcare is probably the next biggest. These two things alone really eat up a lot of household budgets. And, there are some people that think the solution to that is that we have a central planner, probably based here in DC, some agency, where they could stay on staff from 1984 to 2022 to come up with a plan that says, well, you should only have to spend such % of your income on a house. The trouble is, what kind of house? How do you get a better house if you want a better house? How do you get out of it? Central planning fails, and frankly, what has worked? We confuse the outcome that we want with the path to get there. I would love to be able to drain a three-point shot from anywhere on the court. But Steph Curry did a lot of work and had some supernatural talent to be able to do that I don't. I don't go shoot 1,000 shots a day to perfect my talent. I would love to be able to drop a golf ball on a green from anywhere so far out. But the golfers, that's their craft. They spend forever doing it. The challenge is, whatever it is, whatever craft you do, some of it produces more income and some of it produces less income. And, rent costs money. home ownership costs money. And the idea that the government can be the giver of things, it confuses the cause with the effect that we seek. So, Dr. Firth, I just appreciate so much your really common sense breakdown of how subsidies really work. So in your experience, do people not understand how subsidies work, or do they understand it and push for their ideas anyway?
I think a lot of people believe that quantities are fixed. We see this in unemployment policy, where there's like the lump of labor fallacy, where there's just a certain number of jobs out there, and so we just have to deal with the fact that that's the number of jobs there are, and we have to try to get people into them and the right people, instead of thinking, oh, new jobs can be created. And I see the same thing in housing. People sort of think, okay, well, the city's just here. We don't know how it got here, but here it is, and now we just kind of need to play musical chairs until everybody's happy, instead of building new housing.
So you do ascribe some level of ignorance. Not that they're not intelligent folks, they just don't understand economics well. So I don't know that maybe more economic education from K through 12 would solve it, but there just seems to be this disconnect on issue after issue where subsidies or price controls are somehow the remedy when in fact they make things worse. But I want to explain one of the things that I do want to get the panel's views on. So in areas where you can increase supply, in your scenario, a Midwestern town, but let's pick an Ohio one instead, right? So we've seen in my lifetime Columbus, in the center of the state, grow. It expands, and in general, it expands by greenfield expansion. Undeveloped ground is less expensive than already developed ground, so it just sprawls. It spreads further and further out. It requires new infrastructure, which is at public expense, but the land itself was less expensive. Now, what happens when it's easy to expand there? The new investment goes outside the city, and the city core gets hollowed out. So now you have affordable housing in the city, but it's not well maintained. It's not incredibly desirable. So to constrain it, some people say, well, we just have to make it more expensive to develop outside, and then some of the investment will flow to the middle, to the core, back to the core. And some of these ideas like smart growth principles, things like that, have been successful. But what do? They raise the cost intentionally, really. Not everybody apparently understands that it's intentional, and that's how the investment is driven there. But how do you balance the trade-off between preserving the value of the core and facilitating new supply?
That's a tremendous question. I actually testified last week in Minnesota on a state bill, bipartisan, that's trying to strike that balance better in their context. They probably actually have the best system in the US where it's not a strict boundary on sprawl, but there's a water and sewer authority that works with the cities to say, okay, this is where we're gonna build new infrastructure that allows new development, and then what they're working on now in the legislature is trying to get the costs right, making sure that new development pays for itself, but doesn't overpay. I think where smart growth has failed predictably in the US is that they're able to impose regulations on the greenfield, where nobody lives yet, but they're not able to remove the regulations in the city. And so Portland, Oregon, which is the most famous case of this, they're finally getting around to saying, oh yeah, we wanted to densify the city and not grow outside, but we never actually bothered to allow you to build denser buildings, apartments in the city. So if you're gonna have a smart growth policy, boy, you better get the inside part as well as the outside part, otherwise you get what Portland has gotten, which is multi-$100,000 homes that are rising in price as they age and become decrepit instead of falling in price.
Yeah, thanks so much. Perfect illustration, and I think it also highlights kind of the idea that Republicans are for anarchy. And we're not for no laws, we're for common sense laws that work and understand economics. So thanks, Dr. Firth, and I yield.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to first note that this is a really important topic for my constituents. Along with childcare, housing is the issue I hear the most about, and Dr. Firth is right about the cost of housing in San Diego. Just last month, San Diego was ranked the least affordable place to buy a home, overtaking San Francisco and LA. Not sure that's how we wanted to beat San Francisco and LA, but here we are. And rent prices in San Diego are among the fastest growing in the country. Last year alone, the price of rent in San Diego increased nearly 30%. So we know that families are paying more than half their incomes on rent. More families can't afford to buy a home, and more families with children are navigating housing and childcare costs that are increasingly out of reach. So first, I wanted to ask for Ms. Wagner, how can we design housing programs specifically to support children and their families? We know that housing stability is so important for addressing poverty and child poverty. One report from the Children's Defense Fund found that increasing housing support could reduce child poverty by 22%. And we know that housing stability is linked to other better children's outcomes in education and health and earnings, which will save us costs down the road.
Thank you for the question. And Congresswoman Jacobs, I have lots of family in San Diego with young children, so I see what you're talking about firsthand. So first of all, one of the great things that we've observed at Enterprise is that, for example, in our Pacific Northwest office, we're particularly doing something exciting where we're working on the joint development of affordable housing and childcare, and making sure there's a direct link between long-term child success and higher levels of education through these efforts. And so we have specifically created some facilities where we're financing early learning facilities coupled with housing that folks can afford. And we're beginning to expand that throughout that region. And it's really been something we've really been proud of. It's called the Home and Hope program. I'd love to share more with you about it, but it's really a good example of how you couple affordable housing with a childcare facility to actually improve the outcomes of the children.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think both I and the committee would love to get more information on that program. Next, I wanted to talk about vouchers. I know that we've already talked a little bit about them, and to me, it's unacceptable that only 1 in 4 families who are eligible for housing vouchers receive them, especially when we know these vouchers are such an important strategy. But I'm also sensitive to Dr. Firth's concerns that in communities like mine in San Diego, substantially expanding housing subsidies can also unintentionally drive even higher housing prices. So Ms. Wagner and Mr. Donovan, do you see increased housing prices as a potential risk of expanding access to vouchers for families who need them? How can we best protect against that risk if you do see it? And how would you weigh the potential benefits of providing housing stability to all families with those potential risks?
Thank you for the question. First of all, it's great if people that need vouchers get them. I grew up in a community where the person that scooped the ice cream lived around the corner from the doctor, from the police officer, and so forth. So it's important that we put Americans in the position where they can have housing they can afford. And vouchers is one pathway to ensure that property owners can get their rent paid and people can afford to sustain themselves, take care of their families, and get to their jobs. And so I think it's really essential that there be expansion of the voucher program because it helps all involved. It helps the property owners, it helps the residents, and it helps the overall community.
I would just add to that, we now have extensive evidence, not only that vouchers dramatically improve the lives of families, reduce homelessness, they improve the chances of kids, their performance in school, they lead to better health outcomes. They're all kind of evidence of the powerful effect that vouchers have. I would also say there's almost no evidence that vouchers actually raise prices significantly in neighborhoods. The much more serious problem is the problem we've talked about before, especially in places like San Diego, where we have limits on zoning, exclusionary zoning, and other steps that dramatically raise the cost of housing. So we have to do both. We have to invest more in vouchers. And let's be very clear, for the vast majority of recipients of vouchers, they can't even afford the operating costs of a unit. So even if the costs are dramatically increased by regulatory and other barriers, the simple fact is, even if we get rid of all of those barriers, we're still going to need vouchers to help those who are extremely low income be able to afford a decent place to live. And so the fact that only 1 in 4 eligible people in this country actually can get rental assistance is a tragedy, and one that needs to be remedied by Congress. That this is the key thing, the single most powerful thing we could do to alleviate housing distress in our country.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I know we just visited California. I'm glad so much of the conversation today has centered on the issues my constituents are facing in San Diego and other high cost areas. So with that, I will yield back.
The gentlelady from California's time has expired. Mr. Arrington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and witnesses for your participation and your insights. I think we all, once again, have the same goal in mind, which is sustainable housing, affordable and stable housing, if you will, for folks on the low income spectrum. And the question is, how do we best use taxpayer dollars for that public good? And I think one of the challenges, and I talked to Secretary Ben Carson yesterday. I wanted to pick his brain on this. One of the challenges is just having objective data about what programs are working and what programs aren't. For example, the fact that we have a homeless rate for African Americans that is roughly the same as it was in the 60s today is a real problem. And it begs the question, what are we doing that's not working, and why are we still throwing money at things that are not yielding the outcomes that are better for all Americans? And because we're only as strong as our weakest link. And if there is a problem in this community, and I think we've got to find out why the monies aren't changing the situation. And I know there's been Inspector General reports that basically support that. Lack of oversight, lack of visibility into these programs so that we can make the investment on behalf of taxpayers where it will yield the best return. The cost drivers, inflation, out of control and affecting everything from groceries to gasoline to homes and home ownership and rental prices. 20% on average, about $5,000 per family. For many, that's too much. It's unsustainable. The regulatory cost. I'm still shocked to know, and this is, of course, data from the National Association of Home Builders, but $90,000+ of the average home cost is in regulatory costs. So we've got a lot of cost to wrench out in terms of regulations. Then there are the barriers or root causes to the lack of stability in housing for low-income individuals. One of the things that Mr. Carson mentioned was a housing second approach, where there are folks who struggle with addiction and mental health disease that if you don't address it, will be sort of this revolving door of in and out of housing. And so let's find out what some of the bigger, deeper challenges are before we just stick people into a housing program. The other is incentives for self-sufficiency. If we're tied to work, then we will, individuals and families will just do better. And there will be more continuity in housing, and there will be a better chance for greater opportunities for that particular family, except my concern across the board for social services programs, not just housing, supplemental nutrition, child credit, all of these things are becoming a welfare without work expectation, and I think that's a disaster for the very people it's trying to serve, trapping people in dependence and poverty. But there's also the cliff effect, where people aren't incentivized to actually do better because they'll lose some of the government assistance. So there's a perverse incentive in this instead of a seamless off-ramp where people can come up and out of poverty and government assistance. Mr. Secretary Donovan, Mr. Carson had a lot of positive things to say about you, but mentioned the RAD program as an example of public-private partnerships, and said that there's a cap that is preventing the RAD program from growing. It allows for these housing authorities to shift to Section 8 and leverage public debt, private equity for greater maintenance. I'm curious, what do you think about this public-private partnership, and does it need to be expanded? It seems like those are always good ways to do business when you have skin in the game on both sides. Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry, I'm out of time.
The Secretary can give a quick answer.
Quickly, what I'd say is we do need to continue expanding options for public housing. It's a precious resource in the country, and RAD has been a pathway to bring billions of dollars of investment into public housing. And so I would agree with that. I also think expanding investments in family self-sufficiency and others that you mentioned are important, but I also think it's important to look at the evidence that there really is not evidence that investments in housing assistance decrease work. In fact, over the long term, vouchers and other rental assistance increases the work and earnings of recipients. And I think that's a show of how important it is as a baseline for economic success for families.
Thank you so much. Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
time has expired. Ms. Jayapal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For many who choose to, renting is a comfortable alternative to home ownership, but tenants are having such a hard time remaining housed in markets where rent is increasingly out of their reach. In many cities like those I represent in King County, working full-time at $15 an hour still can't get you a 2-bedroom apartment. Unfortunately, these trends have led us to our national homelessness crisis, and housing choice vouchers, as we've been hearing, are part of our strategy to help families afford rent and move families experiencing homelessness into permanent housing. And that's why the American Rescue Plan expanded available vouchers to address the immediate needs of renters everywhere. For Secretary Donovan, families experiencing homelessness with vouchers have very limited income, but they're facing these rising rent markets, and they also encounter landlords with stigmas against them simply because they're unhoused. Private equity has become increasingly prevalent in the rental market during the pandemic. In fact, it represents nearly 53% of all rental properties. What is your view on how this impacts families with vouchers trying to get leases?
Congresswoman, there is no question that we continue to see pervasive discrimination against voucher holders based on race and ethnicity, based on their incomes. And we do need to strengthen and invest in fair housing efforts. In New York, where I was housing commissioner, we instituted local discrimination laws against source of income as a reason for refusing voucher holders. And that has increasingly become an approach across the country that's been an important addition to investing more in fair housing enforcement at the national level as well. And so it is absolutely critical we invest more in vouchers, but that we also create pathways for those families to actually use them in markets like your district and others where there are barriers to using them. Part of that also is investing in the construction of more affordable housing, the supply, and bringing down the kinds of barriers, the exclusionary zoning we talked about earlier.
Yes, I think that that's really important. I've been hearing a lot about how we can't get people into housing because private equity has driven up the rents in so many of these places. And I'll just say that profit-driven corporate landlords are really hurting us in a lot of places, disproportionate majority of eviction filings in places like Houston and Phoenix versus smaller landlords. So I do think we have to pay attention to that. Ms. Wagner, it's crucial for landlords to accept housing vouchers in order to reach our goal of ensuring housing for all. What role should the federal government have in helping them accept vouchers?
Thank you for that. And Sean, I agree, like making sure that there's no source of income of discrimination at the federal level and local level, and making sure that people can have access to the housing that they need. I think putting a policy in place that's widespread across the country will be essential to making sure that people could be housed.
And Mr. Nowak, in your testimony, you shared that chronic homelessness is virtually non-existent in Cuyahoga County due to the Housing First initiative. We know that when people who chronically experience homelessness get permanent supportive housing, 86% remain housed for more than 2 years. I have a bill called the Housing as a Human Right Act that incentivizes more governments to adopt this kind of a housing first strategy. Why does Housing First work to improve economic mobility for people experiencing homelessness?
Sure. In Cuyahoga County, we've focused primarily on the chronically homeless. And for those who don't know what chronically homeless is, those are folks who have been homeless for at least a year and are experiencing some of our highest impediments to being able to be housed: substance use disorders, mental illness, and physical disability. And when we've approached this, this Housing First approach allows for people to have that safe, decent, affordable place to live with low barriers to get there. Once we have people within our Housing First units, we see them staying within the units. Within Cuyahoga County itself, we're seeing a housing stability rate of 95%. Also, what we see is that we estimate that we actually have a cost savings of about $9.2 million to the public every year. Is rather than people being on the street, rather than people potentially being incarcerated, we're working closely with them to help to address their issues, whether it be substance abuse or mental health disorders.
Thank you so much. I think you beautifully explained how housing is at the center of everything else, and it really helps us when we have that kind of approach with wraparound services. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and for hosting such a critically important hearing. So last year, I just want to dive in. Last year in 2021, the New York City Department of Homeless Services counted over 100,000 homeless individuals who slept in our shelter system. This number also included over 30,000 homeless children. Meanwhile, just this past week, the New York Times reported that Huntington, New York, which is an affluent commuter neighborhood that's just a train ride away from my district, approved construction of just 146 subsidized homes after 40 years of fighting for its approval. So it took 40 years for Huntington to approve just 146 subsidized homes in the region. And by one estimate that the article cited, our region needs to add about over 700,000 homes for lower income households. So, this juxtaposition tells us so much about what we need to know about our housing crisis, that the reason why people are on the streets isn't just some elusive housing or market phenomenon. It's also because we've chosen not to build. But Mrs. Wagner, I wanted to begin by discussing how it is that a town like Huntington could get away with refusing to build 146 houses for 40 years. And would it be right to say that our completely decentralized system of zoning regulation has allowed for something like this to happen?
Well, first of all, I really share your concern about the lack of affordable housing options in places like Huntington and in so many other communities nationwide where they work but can't afford to live. And the federal government should really incentivize state and local jurisdictions to ease land use zoning restrictions that contribute to housing supply and the affordability issues which you mentioned. So the fact that it took 40 years to build something tells me that the land is locked and there's no inclusionary zoning, and that the city is not contemplating how working people are housed in the community. And so you really need to incentivize local participation in improving and easing zoning restrictions.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you kind of bringing in alternative models as well. We've seen other countries really, federal governments proactively getting involved in regulated housing in other countries, including through things like fiscal zoning in Germany. Jurisdictions around the world have turned to a widely lauded model of social housing, which redefines housing as a public good, just like mass transportation, libraries, and schools. In fact, in cities like Vienna and Austria, 40% of the housing stock is currently publicly owned social housing. Mr. Nowak, could you help draw a picture of what social housing would look like in the United States in terms of availability and affordability, building management, housing quality, or what it looks like currently in places that have implemented it?
Sure, Congresswoman, thank you. I'd like to point an example that's called Scholar House. It's been implemented within the state of Ohio and Kentucky, and we'll be breaking ground on our first Scholar House here in Cuyahoga County here this May. It's a real partnership between the federal government as well as the local government and a number of our private institutions. So when we look at it, we bring in the Scholar House model is intended to eliminate barriers for parents to be able to finish college, empowering them and their families to have that economic mobility that we hope that that housing can have, as well as taking a two-generational approach to make sure that the children within the property are getting that kind of head start, right? So we use the low-income housing tax credit. We use the home investment partnership, which some of you may be familiar with. We also use project-based vouchers as well as Head Start. And by having an integrated approach and layering these different federal and also local resources to support our services, we're able to provide this economic mobility that's seen families in other similar properties seeing an 86% kind of increase in economic mobility.
And Mr. Nowak, please correct me if I'm wrong, but in this type of model, these type of properties are publicly owned. Residents, however, democratically control them, and they're also available to people of all incomes, and just people of higher incomes pay market rents. Is that correct?
In the social housing model that you laid out, Congressman, yes. Within our Scholar House model, which we developed through the local housing tax credit, we do have income limitations, but there are similar models to what you have said, that we've seen here across the United States.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Donald is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to highlight legislation that I plan to introduce soon that addresses some of the key issues we're focusing on today. And I would love to gain support from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Often we say things like in America, folks have an ability to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And that's something I really do agree with. There is a definite possibility to do that in the United States. But I think it's important to understand the reality is that some people simply don't have boots. And I think that while we can agree that homeownership is one of the most stable ways to build wealth in America, there are barriers that exist for many Americans and the necessary steps in order for them to actually enact on homeownership. There's a lot of discussion and excitement around leveraging alternative data to promote financial inclusion and safely and responsibly expand credit access for people who struggle building credit in the United States. In 2020, a number of years after the project commenced during the Obama administration, Secretary Carson published an initial report which examined the impact of reporting public housing tenant rental payment history to determine whether it would address the issue of credit invisibility, which is prevalent among many people, specifically and especially people who tend to be in remote rural areas and in urban corridors. These findings showed that rent payment can improve both credit visibility and a number of those who score above 620. It also revealed some ongoing challenges. The legislation I'm working on is designed to follow up on this study. It would allow tenants in certain public housing authorities to opt into a pilot program that will allow their rental data to be collected. Rental payments are not considered in credit scores. And this legislation would allow for low-income Americans to build their credit file. Mr. Firth, do you believe Congress should support legislation that leverages alternative data for more housing pathways?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a great question. I don't study mortgages, so I don't want to get too far out over my skis here. I think it's a really important thing to think about. And I think it's really important to think about kind of the potential unintended consequences. I like the idea that you're allowing people to opt in because there's a lot of tension between the idea of giving people credit for their rental history with also, the potential damage caused by having an eviction in your past, which would then be part of your credit history and would be a negative. So I do know there's a lot of Americans currently renting houses that if they had a mortgage on, they would pay even less and they'd be building equity. And that situation really seems backward. So it certainly seems like there's work to be done here, and I applaud you for doing some of that work.
Okay. Second question to that: How would legislation like the Credit Score Competition Act, and I'm not sure if you've actually viewed it, but I'm asking anyway, which directs the Federal Housing Finance Agency to create a process where new credit scoring models can be validated and approved for use by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac when they purchase mortgages and home ownership? Like, how do you think that would probably impact this discussion we're having right now? And Mrs. Bailey, if you want to chime in too, you're allowed to as well. Mr. Firth.
I'd rather pass on that and allow some of the other smart people.
Ms. Bailey.
So a home rental payment is the most equivalent thing to a home mortgage payment. And you're absolutely right that rental payment history is something that should be factored into whether or not a family could afford a home. And as I answer your question, I need to address this issue about subsidies. We've subsidized home ownership in this country for white families at a rate disproportionately to families of color. In the first 35 years of the FHA insured program, only 2% of FHA insured mortgage loans went to black families. That's $120 billion that those families had access to. That's not counting the subsidization of the developers that have been supported through those programs. So when we think about credit scoring and what's factored into credit scoring, one of the largest determinants of your credit score is how much of your actual credit are you utilizing. A family that has been locked out of homeownership over generations doesn't have savings for a down payment. So they are likely going to use a higher percentage of their credit scoring in the purchase of their home, meaning they're going to have a lower overall credit score because of that history of discrimination. So that's how those subsidies work and how they manifest in things like credit scoring. So rental payment history is indeed the very thing that we should look at to determine whether or not a family is able to actually afford a mortgage. And FHA actually has allowed the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they've actually started to actually look at rental payment history.
Ms. Bailey, and I don't want to cut you off. I'm really running out of time. I got like 10 seconds. Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To follow up on your point, I want to make sure people understand, and remind me, it's been a while since I've dealt with FHA loans. What are the current criteria or the previous criteria for actually being approved for a mortgage loan with FHA? Just generally speaking, I know there's large parameters, but generally speaking, what is the criteria?
FHA is a great program. Most borrowers can be approved for a mortgage with a 3% down payment. FHA is the thing that built the American middle class. It just built the middle class in a way that it favored whites, and it told African Americans, Latinos, AAPIs, and Native communities.
Quick follow-up, Ms. Bailey. I know the chairman's really indulging me now. Quick follow-up. Is there a minimum credit score applied to the FHA program that your credit has to be above, or is it just purely having a 3% in order to access the program?
No, there is a minimum credit score, and I don't want to speak off the cuff. I know that it's typically at about 620 and below. So, I'm sorry, 620 and above. So those families who utilize the FHA program actually typically have loans with credit scores that are less likely than some of the credit scoring that might be used to secure loans by the government-sponsored lending process, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which typically use credit scores at about 720 and above. And in today's credit market, we actually see, because of the investments and subsidies we've placed into homeownership since the onset of this crisis, that we actually see the GSEs mostly funding lending opportunities for the wealthiest of Americans. So homeowners who
Ms.
actually—
Bailey, I got to get out now because now I'm really gone long. I do appreciate the points that you're making. The only counterpoint I would make to you is that, we do have to be careful. As somebody who worked, I worked in the mortgage business and in the loan business for a very long time. The down payment and the credit scoring portions of loan applications are critical. I would challenge that they're not so much discriminatory in terms of race. It's much more about ability to repay in a way to shape a loan. But we got to get out.
They bake in the history of discrimination, and I think we both can agree to that.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your overindulgence. I do
The
appreciate
gentleman's time has expired. The chair is going to call for what he anticipates will be a very brief second round, and Mr. Donald's extra 2 minutes will be credited to that second round. I do anticipate that this will be very brief. I'm going to start, and I'm going to yield the bulk of my time to Ms. Moore, but I do want to, the conversation that was just happening was very important, and I do want to, before I yield to Ms. Moore, ask Ms. Bailey and Ms. Wagner, who have made the case around the racial issues associated with housing, to come back to the committee with, again, I'm always focused on what's effective, on those programs that have been effective at addressing the generations-long discrimination that has been leveled by this country at every level of government against communities of color for a long period of time. I've thought a lot about systemic racism, and those are words that Americans hear as accusatory towards them. And oftentimes there's a defensive reaction. And setting aside the question about of racism in America today, particularly in housing, it's undeniable that when you deny a certain population generations worth of access to the prime wealth building mechanism, there will be echoes of that decision in the present. And again, without getting into the judicial argument, because we've seen racially oriented programs turned down by the judiciary in a country over this argument of equality before the law, without getting into those judicial questions, I would like Ms. Wagner and Ms. Bailey and any other witness who would like to do so to highlight for this committee those programs which are working to address racial inequities most effectively. With that, I'm going to be disciplined and yield the balance of my 5 minutes, which is about 4 minutes, Ms. Moore, to Ms. Moore.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to use this opportunity to clear some things up. And forgive me for not being able to state your names at first, because I literally cannot see those cards. I don't have my glasses on, other things. But that being said, I want to ask my first question of Ms. Bailey. We've had a lot of discussion here today. All of us have really raised the challenge of subsidies. And we have had sort of an equivalence made between stuff like the mortgage interest deduction and the low-income housing tax credit or Section 8. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us the difference in those kind of subsidies, because you weren't given an opportunity when you were asked yes or no, do you support the mortgage interest deduction? So here's your shot to answer that question.
My point on subsidies is simply that we've administered them in a racially conscious way towards white Americans. I agree with the chairman that talking about homeownership and racism in homeownership is something that is not easy. But as Americans, we have to think about our country's history so that we can chart a path forward. This discrimination is dragging down the economy for all of us. It's not just hurting people of color, it's hurting people in communities all over the country. We could see our economy grow by $1 trillion for the next 5 years every year if we just address discrimination targeted at Black Americans. And in terms of programs that are effective, that actually work, we actually lift up the special purpose credit programs in our testimony. When you look at special purpose credit programs, they are already authorized under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. They simply allow lenders and other credit service providers to look at the communities that they have a history of underserving and coming up with the solution to bring those people in. Bringing people in means we expand the economy for everyone. So it means homeownership can be a foundation, not only in some suburban communities, but in communities and rural communities all over the nation to help all of us benefit from that economic growth.
Thank you, Dr. Firth. I just want to ask you, you're opposed to subsidies, and I don't know if that's all subsidies or not, but I guess I would just ask a real practical question. You know, you've got somebody, say a certified nursing assistant, working her behind off, making $12.58 an hour, 2 kids. If she doesn't get any kind of subsidy, how can she provide, a 3-bedroom home for her and her 2 kids? What should we do to help her if we don't say you got a Section 8 voucher. I don't like public housing, crowding poor people all in one spot. I'm not a fan of that. But what suggestions would you give this committee on how to address her issue without giving her any kind of subsidy?
That's a great question. I am not opposed to all subsidies.
Okay,
I think that we need to
good.
target subsidies to those who need them, and I think I said that in one earlier answer. The example I used in my testimony was a home buyer credit. People who are on the margin of buying a home are usually at least working class, if not middle class or affluent. And generally, if people who have a middle class income, if they're coming and saying, I can't survive in this market without a subsidy, that means the market has a problem. We should not be subsidizing people up into the 40th and 50th deciles of income.
Let me ask a question about the market. Are you still there, Sean? Yeah, you are. According to this fantastic research that our committee has done from HUD, they said that just since 2000, the turn of the century, that the median price for a rental unit has increased by 61%, and wages have only increased by 10%. The problem with my little CNA example. This is what the market will bear. And so, the blame, according to that report, seems to come from the relatively low rate of building new homes. So I just want you to respond to the reasons that HUD issued versus some of the things that we hear about subsidies, increasing the price of housing and other things. Just, Mr. Former Secretary, please.
Congresswoman, thank you, and good to see you. I want to reiterate what I said before, which is there is no good evidence that vouchers and other forms of rental assistance raise the price of housing significantly in ways that we should be concerned about. And we have to focus in looking at what you rightly say is a decades-long increase in affordability challenges for Americans, both the growing inequality and dropping wages, but also the lack of construction for zoning reasons, but also the critical barriers that have been placed in the way of families being able to rent housing, the discrimination and other things that we've talked about today. And we need more. The fact that only 1 in 4 eligible Americans can get rental assistance is a fundamental problem in the growing unaffordability of housing that Congress has the power to fix.
I hear the gavel. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think this has been a pretty good conversation today. I think one of the things we've really highlighted is the impact that the cost of rising rents, the impact that that has on Americans. Inflation impacts everybody, but it clobbers seniors on fixed incomes and low-income workers. And it clobbers low-income workers in particular because they're seeing their rents increase. And as we saw last year, rents are increasing at 14%, housing at 20%, rent at 14%. And if wages aren't keeping up with inflation, which they're not, it gets harder and harder for low-income workers. So I think it's paramount that we get inflation under control and we get our spending under control here in Washington. But let me shift, because I think we're having a robust conversation. Where do we spend our money? How do we make it most effective, most useful? And if I can go to you, Secretary Donovan, in your comments, you pushed or suggested that we should further subsidize housing, in particular, the vouchers would be a good place to invest. How much more money would you suggest we put into vouchers per year?
Currently, we have about 2 million vouchers available around the country. And given that only 1 in 4 Americans that is eligible actually receives rental assistance, roughly quadrupling the amount of rental assistance would be critical. But I want to be clear, I also talked earlier about the fact that there is money that is not well spent.
Yep.
If we were to better target the mortgage interest deduction,
I'm not.
the families that really make it a credit.
Let me reclaim my time for a second here. It's a little bit. It's challenging when we're not in person. I know. I just want to keep this concise. So you would quadruple it. What would be the total amount there if we quadrupled it? for a dollar amount? And I understand we can find other efficiencies.
Depending on the range of programs, it would be tens of billions of dollars per year.
Tens of billions of dollars. Okay, fair enough. And let me come back, if I can, to you, Ms. Bailey. You noted that we often subsidize whites more than blacks. Is that your opinion?
Correct.
In obviously, we're looking at ways that we do that as a country. And I know you didn't want to answer whether or not you like the SALT tax cuts or not, but boy, oh boy, when I look at the data, it sure seems like that's something that we should be looking at. And if we have a limited amount of resources, and Secretary Donovan saying he's got an idea over here of quadrupling vouchers, and say I just accept that on the surface that, boy, that's the policy that we want to go, cost tens of billions. Well, inside the Build Back Better plan, the Democrats put forward about $100 billion a year in tax cuts, and the majority of that, the overwhelming majority of that, is going to white families making over $200,000 a year. It seems like we got a major disconnect about the best policy to move forward. On one hand, I'm hearing from some of the majority's witnesses that, boy, oh boy, we're subsidizing whites over blacks. That sounds like a heck of a problem we should dig into. And then on the other side, I hear policies from the majority that are saying, you know what, we got a plan, we should put about $100 billion a year or so into a tax cut that's gonna help rich white families. It sure sounds a little bit like hypocrisy to me. I don't wanna go too far over my skis there, but boy, oh boy, that might be something that we wanna look into about how we're spending our money, because it's all housing policy across the board. We can either spend it through vouchers, we can spend it through the tax code, but the federal government's getting involved if we look at the policies that are being put forward. And I think the words, Mr. Chairman, that there's echoes of racism, and you, Ms. Bailey, are identifying that we're often subsidizing some groups more than others, and yet we see a Build Back Better plan that was passed that has the biggest spending, billions of dollars, $100 billion a year roughly, $300 billion through 2025 to subsidize high-income households, disproportionately white. So let me pause there, because I want to come back if I can. I just had to get that off my chest briefly. I'm going to let you submit for the record, but I got to be limited on my time, unfortunately. But I want to come back to you, Mr. Firth, because I do think we see some things working, and the states are driving this, and in particular, getting supply up to bring costs down, to make it more affordable, to be more efficient with our investments. And what, if you could just take and put a pin on it, what do you think the best things that the states are doing, our incubators of innovation are doing across this country to try to raise supply and bring prices down?
Thank you, great question. So I applauded California's accessory dwelling unit policy, which has been bipartisan. Another from Wisconsin is Wisconsin and North Carolina both got rid of the protest petition process, which is a super obscure law that 20 states have that allows a very small number of neighbors to hold up a rezoning. And it's usually used to block things that people don't necessarily want. So I've seen it used to block gas stations, restaurants, and affordable housing. A case that I led a brief recently was in Tulsa. A church and a Christian university used the protest petition law to block turning half of a hotel into homeless veterans housing. So reforming or getting rid of those laws is one step that states can take to actually free their cities to be more flexible in their zoning. So that's one small example, and congratulations to Wisconsin.
Always congratulations to Wisconsin. Even Ms. Moore will agree with me on that, I know, although we don't agree on everything on Wisconsin. But let me wrap it up like this. I think we have a real necessity in this country to address what's occurring on our inflation side, because it's clobbering renters as rent costs continue to skyrocket. And I think we have to become far more efficient in how we're making our investments to help people who are struggling in housing. And I think the number one thing we can do is to work to drive supply up to bring costs down. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I don't see other members. I actually yielded my time to Ms. Moore, so Ms. Moore does in fact have time if she wishes to use it.
Ms. Moore will use her time. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady's
I just want to thank
5 minutes.
the ranking member. I was born in the ranking member's district, so I know his constituency well. It is some of the worst housing stock in our state in Racine. It has maybe the highest unemployment rate among African Americans in the state, in his district. So these are people who could benefit a great deal by having more housing options. I guess I wanted to get back to you, Ms. Bailey, since you seem to be kind of catching on fire this morning with regard to subsidies and so on. What you were sharing with us with regard to racism and subsidies, this was not your personal opinion, was it? This was history, right? Can you just,
Yes.
was this historical with regard to, wages, housing, FHA policy? Can you just briefly share with us whether this was your opinion or history?
It's American history. When you look at our country's laws, there are a bevy of laws since the Head Rights Act that help settlers come to the United States to really start to help found the 13 original colonies. This is our nation's history. The reality, though, is that we have this opportunity through inclusive policies to change that history. That's what I'm here today asking the committee to acknowledge. We can intentionally use race-conscious policies to right the race-conscious policies that didn't include all of us. And we can, again, grow our economy by $1 trillion a year over the next 5 years. And that's only data when you are thinking about African Americans. That's not looking at the discriminatory impact for other targeted and marginalized communities. We all have a stake in this. This kind of inclusive growth will help all of us. The Build Back Better Act's $150 billion that's invested in housing that the House passed, critical dollars to further racial equity, but not just racial equity. When you look at a targeted down payment assistance program, 1.4 million of those homeowners are white. So when we take the step to use inclusive policies, we actually reach people in rural communities who are often left out by these same practices. So this isn't an opportunity to divide us as a nation. This is actually the very opportunity that we need to use housing as a fundamental right to bring all of us forward.
So what you're describing is literally, since practically the Mayflower almost, that we have deliberately put in place policies that create inequity in housing, FHA, veterans housing, all that. And so now you would like to use race-based solutions to reverse it, quite frankly. Okay, so let me just ask one more question. The Build Back, I just want to make an announcement, really, not ask a question. In the Build Back Better program, where the proposal to restore the SALT deduction, is that part of the $150 billion that you're talking about? Because that didn't pass, by the way. That is not current policy where we're subsidizing the wealthiest Americans. That did not pass at all. So as we talk about the disparities in home ownership, that is not contributing in any way to the disparity. What's the $150 billion in particular that was in Build Back Better that you were trying to lift up?
It includes the largest ever investment in funding for local fair housing enforcement, the very thing that we said we need here today. It includes $10 billion for targeted first-generation down payment assistance. This would be down payment assistance to families whose prior generations did not have access to home ownership. So again, 1.4 million whites, 1.7 million blacks, and 1.32 million Latinos. It would also include funding for the Neighborhood Homes and Investment Act, helping us to really get at the affordable housing crisis that we are experiencing all over the country, helping us to revitalize communities that were left behind by the subprime crisis, a crisis where we have to be honest, investors led the market and led it to a crash. It was the only time we had a privately funded housing sector, and our entire economy suffered.
Okay, I got 30 seconds left, so I just want to use the rest of my time to say this. This is an opportunity that we have to, you made the point that this doesn't just hurt Black people, it hurts everybody. And part of, Milwaukee is sort of the, epicenter of redlining. And so what happened was they redlined the inner city, and unscrupulous realtors would go 2 blocks over and scare white people and have them sell their homes for less than their value. The blacks are coming. And so redlining has harmed everybody. Is that what I've heard you attest to?
Yes, and homes that are predominantly African-American, we see them undervalued by about $48,000 per home. We're talking about $156 billion a year that we're seeing homes in Black communities undervalued. When you look at whole cities like Chicago, we see Black residents, and I'm talking about residents who were doctors and lawyers, teachers, you know, they were our firefighters, they were ordinary folk just trying to make the best from themselves. They were steered into contracts for deeds. Those deeds cost them millions and millions of dollars. That's unearned wealth that ends up in our credit scoring system. So when we talk about credit scores and that gap between that 620 and that 720 that we discussed between Black and white, we're talking about race. And we've got to be willing to have that hard discussion, because only when we have that hard discussion can we come up with the very practical solutions like targeted first-generation down payment assistance, utilizing special purpose credit programs that are already law under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Can we grow this economy by trillions of dollars, creating billions of jobs and generating, creating thousands of jobs and generating billions of dollars in very local revenues that we talked about today.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I see no further members, so the second round was crisp as hoped for. And I'd really like to thank all of our witnesses for what was a robust and substantive conversation. And without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. With that, and with my gratefulness to all of our witnesses, the hearing is adjourned.